Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. Standing a little more than 13,000 feet above sea level, the Eiger is one of the picturesque mountain peaks in the Alps. Its summit was first conquered in 1858 by Irishman Charles Barrington, but climbing the summit via its north face route has never been explored. It wasn't until 1935 that the first serious attempt to climb that route was pushed through. The following year, two pairs of climbers grouped together for a second attempt. And this is their horrifying story. Viewer discretion is advised. Located in the Bernese Alps in Switzerland, the highly coveted Eiger overlooks the beautiful village of Grindelwald in the district of Interlaken. Not much details have been recorded of the first successful summit, but the Eiger summit was first reached by Irishman Charles Barrington along with two guides from Grindelwald named Christian Almer and Peter Boren. The historic climb happened on August 11, 1858 through the West Flank and West Ridge route. There had been many expeditions that followed since then, but there has never been a single serious attempt to climb the picturesque summit through its north face route, fondly called the Eiger Wand. The fact that the Eiger Wand has been unclimbed for many years had its obvious reasons. It had steep slopes at an angle of around 70 degrees, required long ascents with no convenient resting stops, and more than anything else, was highly prone to avalanches due to its loose rock and snow. During summer, when mountain climbing expeditions are usually at its peak, rocks the size of a fist frequently fall off and melted snow usually makes its way down the mountain's steep slopes. Also, because it was concave in shape, the mountain's wide face was constantly under a shadow, making it very cold. Strong winds are also a challenge. And so, more often than not, conditions at the face get very different from the weather at the mountain's base. With all these factors combined, it's basically a disaster waiting to happen. In 1935, however, two highly experienced German climbers from Bavaria were daring enough to risk the first ever serious attempt to conquer the Eiger Wand. The brave adventurers were Karl Maringer and Max Sedlmayr. Now, Eiger actually had train tracks up to one-third on the way up, at the Eiger Wand station. Additionally, what sets the Eiger expeditions apart was the fact that its face can almost entirely be seen from a small mountain resort at the base of the mountain. On good weather, guests at Klein Skydeg, the resort town, could clearly see the climbers going up the north face route. Thus, when the two German climbers made the daring first attempt, the media gathered and stayed at the resort to witness through their binoculars and document the record-breaking attempt. The plan to conquer the summit was estimated to take around 2 to 3 days, so the two brought 6 days' worth of supplies with them. They arrived at Eiger Wand station and set up camp to spend the night there. The next morning, onlookers from the resort town watched them as they went ahead slowly but surely, through the first major ice field of the whole climb. By the third day, they went through the second major ice field and surpassed it. Onlookers saw the two climbers already near the summit, but then not long after, thick clouds blocked their view of the face. It was only on the fifth day that the skies cleared and the Eiger Wand was again visible to them below. The scene that unfolded shocked the onlookers. The whole face of the mountain was now covered in thick fresh snow. Apparently, an avalanche blocked their way going down, so they could no longer descend in the same route. It left the pair with nowhere to go but up. They were able to reach the third ice field, still thousands of feet to go until they reached the summit. Unfortunately, no more traces of the two climbers have been observed since then. A few days later, a search and rescue plane hovered above the Eiger trying to look for the two climbers and found them all frozen, with one still standing in the ice field. Because of this, the third ice field was then called the Death Bivouac. This first attempt may have ended tragically, but it didn't stop other daring climbers to take on the challenge. Immediately, in the year that followed, around 10 men had planned to give it a try. Some of them were even the climbers that had been part of the search and rescue operations the year prior. Come July 1936, 6 out of the 10 had to back out of the risky climb due to extreme weather conditions and a few accidents. The 4 climbers, however, remain unfazed by the obvious dangers of the Eiger. Two men named Andreas Hinterstoicer and Tony Kurz, were from Bavaria, while the other two, Willi Angerer and Eddie Rayner, were from Austria. Initially, these 4 climbers were grouped by pair, but they all decided to team up and proceed with the climb with all 4 of them together. Day 1 of their climb had its own misadventures. Andreas slipped and fell 37 meters down the mountain face, but thankfully, he was able to come out of the fall unscathed, and the group continued to move forward. Upon reaching one of the steep rock faces now known as Hinterstoicer Traverse, Andreas fixed some ropes so the 4 of them could cross to the other side of the rock face. When they reached the other side, he untied the ropes, a move they would later on regret doing. As the sun began to set that first day, clouds also began to block the onlookers' view. Along with the sunrise the following day, skies cleared up and onlookers were back to checking on the group's progress. It was then that they noticed something odd, having no idea exactly what they had missed over the night. Eddie and Willi were no longer moving forward, and from afar, people could see Eddie seeming to be attending to Willi. After a while, Andreas and Tony then dropped a rope to where Willi was, as Willi now proceeded on with Eddie carefully following after him. It was already noon when the 4 reached the death bivouac, where the 2 German climbers who died a year prior were found. Onlookers could see how Willi was really struggling with his injury. Then the next thing they knew, all 4 climbers were now starting with their descent. It was then that onlookers were able to confirm Willi's serious condition, enough to make them abandon the climb. They reached the second ice field by the end of day 2. However, going back down to the first ice field, their biggest hurdle would be the rock face that they had traversed using the fixed ropes. Since Andreas took the ropes off, it was harder to set it up during descent, and it was the only way going down. The following day, conditions became worse. A storm came and avalanche upon avalanche rolled down the mountain's steep slopes, bringing rocks tumbling along with the snow. Because of this, visibility from the resort town was close to zero, but after a while the clouds cleared up and people were able to see the serious threat and challenge it created on the climbers. The rock face that the climbers were heading next to had already been covered with a frozen layer following the avalanche. Rain has also poured down the night prior, so you can just imagine how thick and slippery the frozen fresh rainwater was. There was no way they could still pass through the traverse. It left the climbers with no other option but to rappel down the 600-foot cliff face. Albert von Allman, a fellow mountaineer who was one of the onlookers below, decided to take the train going to Eiger tunnel, upon realizing the 4 climbers' desperate situation. He went to the windows near the base of the cliff that the 4 were about to rappel through. Albert peeked out the window and yelled to check on the 4. Surprisingly, all 4 responded to him and told him they would be down soon. Knowing the climbers needed to warm themselves after this grueling ordeal was over, Albert went on to prepare a pot of tea as he awaited their arrival. 2 hours went by and there were no signs of the climbers yet. Albert was becoming worried, so he peeked out the window once more and yelled to check on them. However, only one responded. It was Tony Kurz. The strong winds made it difficult to hear Tony clearly, but Albert was able to catch 2 points. The other 3 were dead, and Tony, the sole survivor, was now hanging hundreds of feet above the train tunnel window, left with no other way to proceed with the descent alone. Without delay, Albert immediately called the Eiger Gletscher station at the mountain's base and sought for a rescue party to be sent there quickly. Knowing the extreme risks, the head of the Mountain Rescue Committee had this policy that no one should be forced to join any rescue mission. That day, 3 guides willingly volunteered and hopped on the train to the tunnel window where Albert was. They went out of the Eiger tunnel through the windows and hiked up diagonally, heading for the base of the cliff where Tony was now stuck. When they reached the base, Tony recounted to the 3 rescuers what happened hours prior. At that point, they could all still hear the strength in Tony's voice despite that day had been day 3 of their climb. Tony told them they were beginning to rappel down when an avalanche rolled down and hit all 4 of them. Andreas completely fell off the face of the mountain to sure death. Now, Tony and the other 2 climbers, Willi and Eddie, were tied to a single rope together. Tony was positioned in the middle. Willi and Tony had also been wiped out of the mountain's face, sending them down the cliff. The rope they were attached to got tangled around Willie's neck, causing him to be strangled to death. Eddie, on the other end of the rope, who was left on top of the cliff face, crashed against a huge rock and broke his skull. He initially survived but later on froze to death. He was still pressed against the rock, allowing Tony to keep hanging alive down below him. Tony was in the middle of the cliff face, hanging around 300 feet away from both the top and bottom of the cliff face. Rescuers needed to climb another 600 feet of loose ice if they intended to reach Tony. If they were also to throw a rope up to Tony, 300 feet was simply too far to throw it up. The sun was now beginning to set. The rescuers knew there was even greater risk if they went on with the rescue attempt in the cold of the night. So they told Tony they would be descending back to the train tunnel and return the next morning. Tony cried out and begged for rescue, telling them that he might not make it through the night, as the volunteers headed back to the tunnel window. Early the next morning, they went back to the cliff base and saw Tony with 8-inch-long icicles already hanging from his boots. Overnight, a strong wind flew his mitten off of his left hand, and now it had been completely frozen up to his lower left arm. As the volunteers were back to their rescue attempt, they knew that with the equipment they had then, it was nearly impossible to climb up the frozen rock face. They first attempted to throw Tony a rope, even using rockets to launch the rope further to the height where Tony was. However, after many tries, the ropes just kept flying away from the cliff instead of nearer to Tony. The second plan involved was for Tony to lower down a small rope to them, and once it reached them, they would tie one of the rescue ropes for Tony to pull up and attach to the existing rope. In that way, Tony could now have an extended rope which he could continue rappelling all the way down to the base of the cliff. However, Tony didn't have any other rope left. They had to look for another rope for Tony to lower down. Then, the rescuers thought of a plan, but it would need Tony's little strength left to pull off. The rescuers instructed Tony to rappel all the way down to the end of the rope and cut away Willie's frozen body. After cutting it off, he would need to pull himself up the rope again and secure himself before cutting the rope below him. Once cut, he would now have a small rope which he could untwine to have multiple thinner ropes that he could tie together to make a longer rope. This longer but thinner rope would then need to be lowered down to where the rescuers were so they could attach a stronger rope for him to pull up. Once Tony got the stronger rope from the rescue team, he would have to tie and connect it to his rope so he could continue on with his descent. In almost 5 grueling hours, he cut off Willie's dead body from the rope, which didn't actually fall because his body had already been stuck frozen to the cliff, pulled himself up to around 25 feet with only one hand, and cut off the rope below him with his axe. He had to untwine the rope and connect it all together using only his right hand and his teeth. Tony struggled but managed to secure the thinner rope that he would be lowering down to the rescuers. When afternoon came, another avalanche of snow and rocks came tumbling down. It detached Willie's frozen body from the cliff face, sending the dead body rolling past the rescuers to the bottom of the mountain. After much struggle, Tony was able to finally lower a thinner rope down to the rescuers. The rescuers tied a thicker and stronger rope and a few climbing supplies in case Tony might be needing it on the way down. Apparently, the rope they attached still fell short in length, so they tied a second rope on one end. Slowly, Tony pulled the rescue rope along with the gears up. With his left arm frozen, it took Tony around an hour to pull it all up, tie it to his rope, and eventually start rappelling down the cliff. Tony was already very close to the cliff base. The rescuers could already see him about 20 feet above them when suddenly, Tony had already reached the end of the first rescue rope. The knot that connected the 2 ropes attached by the rescuers was too big to fit through Tony's carabiner. Tony grunted and groaned as he tried to force the knot through the carabiner. The rescuers could hear his frustration, just as they were frustrated themselves. They tried to motivate him, shouting and telling him this would be the last and final hurdle he needed to conquer. After all that he had been through, he was 20 feet away from his much-needed rescue, and yet, having drained all of his energy, ironically, he felt so far. Tony tilted forward, toward the cliff, and tried using his teeth one last time. His left arm stuck out frozen, his lips barely moved as he struggled with frostbite and exhaustion. Not a single ounce of energy was left in Tony's body, he could no longer do it. Then, with a weak voice, he uttered the words, "I'm finished," before his body lay lifeless hanging over the rescuers. The rope was almost within reach of the rescuers, if only a few feet more. Tony got so close, yet he still didn't make it. In the end, the 1936 attempt ended tragically with all 4 climbers dead, twice the fatalities of the first attempt in the year prior. The first successful attempt to conquer the Eiger through the Eiger Wand route only happened in July 1938 by 2 German climbers named Anderl Heckmair and Ludwig Vorg. Thank you for making it this far. If you liked our video, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel. Let us know your thoughts and story suggestions in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. Again, thank you and see you on the next one.